It's time for us to begin our study this morning, our Bible study here at North Lexington. We'd like to welcome everyone. If you're visiting with us, you are our honored guests and hope you can remain after services that we can introduce ourselves to you. Our study today this quarter has been in the area of Matthew. Last week we talked about the first part of Matthew chapter 15. We want to go ahead and continue that area of study today. Prior to us beginning, I'd like to ask Ron Ray, if he would, to lead us in prayer.
Lord and loving Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for this opportunity to open your word, to study it. We ask that you give us the ability to comprehend, give us the ability to learn from your word, not only how and what, but also why. Lord, we ask that you please be with each of us today, whether it be in this study or the children or other studies throughout the world, and help them to focus on you, help them to determine your will, and have the determination to follow them. Not their desires, but yours. Lord, we ask that you please be with all the teachers, David, Bobby, and all of the children's teachers. We ask that you give them a courage to continue to focus on you, to continue to study and to teach. Lord, we ask that you give each of us opportunities to teach others. Give us the wisdom to recognize those opportunities. And Lord, we ask that as we study the book of Matthew today, that we see the example of Christ, to follow it, to glean something that we can take out and use in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. All right. Oh, yeah. I'm not doing James. This is Matthew. I think they changed the topic on me. That's right. I was trying to figure out why I needed this because I don't have any slides. But anyway, all right. So we'll leave this where we can put it up here for Steve, I guess. But whatever. Anyway, I was wondering why that James sign was up there, but now I know. Okay. In the first part of chapter 15, we talked last week about primarily about the traditions of men and how they tried to impose traditions of what law says or what it's supposed to say that was contrary to God's word upon those that were trying to live in accordance to what God said. And we concluded our study last week at verse 20. So we want to begin today, continue looking at this area here. At this time, Jesus had been around Jerusalem and the area here and been focusing all of his efforts at this time in that particular geography. However, as we start and look at verse 21, then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And so we find here that Jesus is leaving, you might say, his comfort zone, an area that he is very familiar with, an area that he has a lot of support by the Jews for, and he is venturing out into what we would call the Gentile area, the territory for the Gentiles. So he's leaving Galilee, he's leaving the area and Jerusalem, and he's now getting out in this area. He goes toward Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre is about 25 miles north of Galilee, and Sidon's about 25 miles north of even that of Tyre. So this is the general vicinity, but he's left and gone into Gentile territory there. Now, verse 22, it says, "And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. my daughter is severely demon-possessed. And we mentioned this very briefly at the conclusion of class last week. And the Matthew account says that she was a woman of Canaan, a Canaanite. Now, the other accounts in Mark says she was a Syrophoenician by birth. And it also notes in the commentaries that the reference to a Canaan or a Canaanite, this is the only time in the entire New Testament that this word is used. However, Canaanite was used very often in Old Testament times. And in many places it related to trader, to a merchant, and mainly in the act of practicing on cheating other people with false balances. So they were cheating people when they were selling things to them and taking advantage of them. So when you have the term Canaanite or Canaanite, it is not one that is the most ideal to have. But even in this area that this lady is in, which is not the most suitable area, but she herself recognized Jesus as the Messiah because of the comments that she made. And the comment that she made is that Jesus is the son of David. And so this is commendable upon her part. Now, go back to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. We've talked about this, or Brandon talked about Matthew 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, and the son of Abraham, referring to Jesus. Now, let's move forward, if you would, and Brandon will be covering this, but let's go to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, verses 41 and 42. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." So, we can see here that he is recognized as the son of David, even in this area of country that he is now residing in. Now, look at the first part of verse 23. But he answered her not a word, and his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." Again, she had approached Jesus in plea to have her daughter, who was severely demon-possessed, relieved of this challenge that she had. And but Jesus himself didn't answer her at all. Why? What was the intent here, or what do you think the intent of Jesus here was? He obviously heard her. There's no question about it. But he just completely didn't respond. Why would you think that?
He was getting ready to teach his disciples something. And because he let this play out, he was able to teach them. He could have just went ahead and done it, been over with,
right,
and moved on. But he was getting ready to teach what I call a teachable moment for his disciples.
Exactly right. It was a teachable moment. It was an opportunity to teach, and this was a strategy that he had in order to make certain that he was going to take advantage of this. It wasn't that he was ignoring her. He was going to address it at some point. But he's trying to share and teach the disciples as he went along. The disciples themselves said that they would just soon send her away. In other words, give her what she wants and move her out, or just do away. We don't want to be fooling with her. Now, verse 24, but he answered and said, "I was not sent except to lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now, Jesus' message that he was sharing would eventually come back to the Gentile world. There's no question about it. It was going to happen, but it wasn't going to happen right then. His mission, his sole mission, was to teach whom? the Jews, the Jewish nation. That was his first and foremost goal and clear-cut objective was at this time was to teach the Jewish nation and at some point in time in the future come back to the Gentile world and share that message at that time. Now, this is not an uncommon approach. When Jesus sent his apostles on the limited commission, he told them not to go in the area of the Gentiles, not to go in the city of Samaria, but to go find the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, Matthew 10, go back a few chapters, Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6. 10, 5 and 6. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, do not go into the way of the Gentiles, we're talking here, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but to go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel that we've talked about. Now, go back to Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. In Acts 1 and verse 8, we see here, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Look at the priority here that he's given. First, it's going to be to me in Jerusalem, to all of Judea, and then everybody to the end of the earth is the focus of where it would be. From Jesus' focus here of teaching the Jewish nation, trying to share with them this word, what would be a teachable moment for us today? What can we learn from this example? Are we to be selective of who we teach the gospel to? What would be right here in this verse here, what would be something that we can draw off of that could be an application for today?
We're supposed to take the word to everybody,
Right.
not just the ones that we choose. And when we look at people, we shouldn't look at people as this one's worthy and this one's not.
Right.
We need to, because in God's eyes, they're all worthy of hearing the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Ken says not be selective, they're all worthy. Okay, others? What would be other applications that you think of with Jesus? His focus here is to, at this point in time, spread the word to the Jewish nation, Gentiles at a later time. What's another? Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Okay, what else? Anything? Yes, Sarah.
Everything that he was doing, Jesus, was fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Things that had been prophesied on and on. The Jews are the ones that knew God,
Mm-hmm.
knew at least in some form. And so he was focusing on them, where they were, and then it was going to spread. But at that time,
Mm-hmm.
to do what? He deal with people that already had some kind of background.
Right.
Still not.
Exactly. Ron?
I think the example, I don't know if this is what you're getting to, but there are times in our lives where we actually have to focus. There are certain times, okay, this is what I can do, so I've got to put all my effort into this. I will get to everything else eventually.
Right.
But right now, my best work will need to be focused on a limited amount. So, and again, that's not at all times.
Right.
But there are times in our lives where we may need to focus on one particular work.
Right. Exactly right. The area that Ron said was about focus, and that was kind of what I was thinking about as well. All the answers are perfect, but Jesus had a clear-cut focus of what his responsibility and what he was supposed to do. He had no doubt what he was supposed to do. and that was to teach and spread the word to the Jewish nation. And we need, and we should, and we probably do, but we always want to be keen on it, that we have a focus to preach and spread the gospel every day, every week, every hour that we can. That's our mission while we're here on this earth. And we may have to come back and do some things at a later date, but we don't need to let any of the things of this world, if at all possible, get in the way of why we exist here. And Jesus knew his clear-cut mission. We need to have that focus like Jesus did. And we need to teach and preach the gospel, but make sure we have a focus on where we want to be and what we want to do in regard to that. Other comments before we move off that? Wait.
The gospel is for all who believe, and the word is not in respect of any man.
That's right.
It's for all.
Yeah. Wick says the gospel's for all, the word's for all, there's no respecter of any man. And that's exactly right. So Jesus was taking this opportunity as a teaching moment, and he was using this to try to share the information that he wanted to in regard to this area. Now, let's look at verse 25 and 26. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. At this time, is this unusual to be calling a Gentile a dog? It's not, because in that time and in that area and that history, all non-Jewish people were referred to as a dog. And so, by no means, when Jesus says this, is he being derogatory toward this lady at all. But as we dig deeper, we can see that actually he's going to be helping her and working with her in regard to that. There's two definitions of dogs. In the commentaries in the Bible, we have Matthew chapter 7. Go back to Matthew 7:6. Matthew 7, chapter 6. Yeah, why don't we try that one? Matthew 7, verse 6. Matthew 7, verse 6. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. This is referencing a dog that is mangy, that is not kept. They're not good. They are cruel animals. They're dirty. This is what it's referring to in relation to this right here. In Matthew 15:26, it's not talking specifically about this type of a dog. So again, the non-Jewish people are referenced as dogs, and they understand that. And so in Brother Linsky's commentary, talks about the Greek word kanara, which is little pet dogs. In the Orient, there's no owners of dogs. They run wild. They're savage. But this is a whole different concept here, in that this is not an offensive term that's been presented by Jesus to this lady, but it refers to little pet dogs, those that have owners, those that keep them in the house, those that feed them sometimes little bits and pieces from the table. Any of you have pets that you might in-house? You ever have any pets you might feed from the table sometime? Nobody. I bet you there's not a soul going to shake their head yes, and they're saying, I sure do, but I ain't going to volunteer this. But anyway, so this is the ones that there's concern for and care for, and in regard to those areas there. And so the children's table is referencing whom here? Who's it referencing, or what is it referencing? Jews. The Jews. The children's table is the Jews, exactly right. And so, and she said, Yes, Lord, that even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table. So, what was she wanting? What was she wanting? Was she wanting Jesus to completely abandon what he was doing and go and take care of her daughter? What was she wanting? Just a crumb, and that is take care of healing my demon-possessed daughter. I don't want the whole thing. I just want a crumb. That's all I'm asking for. And he knew her heart, and he knew that. The only thing that Jesus was trying to share with his disciples and the woman was to accept the divine plan that his mission was to teach the Jewish nation, and that any time, any activity related to the Gentiles or any of these blessings that was going to be laid out on the children's table for the Jews, if it was received by the Gentiles at that moment, it was purely by chance, by a crumb falling off the table, you might say. But he recognized that, and he knew that from her heart that she was sincere for what she was doing there. And she said in verse 28, then Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Jesus was deeply moved by her faith. And it says in commentaries, it says that it's the only time in Matthew that Jesus calls anyone's faith great. And her daughter was healed there. Look at verse 29 to 31. Verse 29 to 31. Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up to the mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the mute, the maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they glorified the God of Israel. So we find that the teaching goes on, the healing goes on. He's having an opportunity to continue to teach. Now, what's so unusual about what's about to come up? What does Jesus recognize about these followers that have followed him up so far and been following him all this time? What has occurred? What's occurred? What's he about to do? They had not eaten in 3 days and 3 nights. Did they say that to him? Do you think they mentioned that to him? I don't. It's no indication they ever did at all. But it showed that Jesus had compassion on them, and that he realized that they had been traveling because of following him and all the activities. And they have not eaten for 3 days and 3 nights. Again, an application, I think, for us today is at this moment, and many others in the life of Jesus, he recognized and demonstrated compassion to others. So what does that tell us today? Where opportunity arises, we in turn need to demonstrate and show compassion where compassion is due. We need to have that love, that demonstration of love. And we need to be, as Jesus, when we recognize it, take action on it. Not to say, and this is something that I know I'm guilty of, but not to say, okay, that person really needs some attention, but somebody else will take care of that. But we don't need to be that way. We need to be and demonstrate compassion. So he demonstrates compassion here, which I think is really, really outstanding, you might say, in regard to that. Verse 32 through 38. Someone read that, if you would. Verse 32 to 38.
Disciples to himself and said, I have
Okay.
He took the 7 loaves and the fish and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 7 large baskets full of the fragments that were left.
Okay. And the last word, yeah, please.
And he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we have here the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000. We've already talked about Jesus demonstrating compassion and our learning for us today. In Mark's account, in Mark 8, 1 through 13, it was another feeding. And this was provided by the lunch. It was for this boy to eat. The bread here in Matthew, the 7 loaves and a few fishes came from the disciples that were there. And he was able to feed them without any difficulty under any circumstance there. Now, interesting enough, that I think we've talked about this before, and I know Brandon has some of the symbolism about numbers. And in the Mark account of the feeding of the 5,000, there were 12 baskets left over, and 12 represents the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament, or the 12 apostles from the New Testament, and 7 baskets was what was left in the Matthew account, and that is what? What does that number symbolize? 7 is complete. Spiritual completion or perfection, and perfection in the Bible there. So we see here that he has opportunity to work with this lady of Canaan and to help and to make it and let it be a teaching opportunity here. Now, for the chapter of Matthew 15, any comments, any other observations that you'd like to share of anything we've talked about thus far today or last week, either one there?
We're talking about the various meanings of Canaanite in different contexts.
Yes.
The Canaanites were one of the groups that they were told to totally wipe out when they came into the land.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly right. Exactly right. Other comments? All right. Let's move on to chapter 16. Chapter 16. Verse 1. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. They're not giving up, are they? They've already pleaded many times back, show us a sign, or you shouldn't do this and you did that and you shouldn't have had, or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of differences in opinion between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But isn't it interesting here that all these differences between these two sects of people have been put aside and they all come together to do what? Try to trap Jesus. Try to show him up. They put all their effort. They don't even like each other, but they come together to try to get Jesus and trap Jesus and use it as a moment to prove him incorrect. And that was what the only intent they were trying for here. Other examples of this happening, Herod and Pilate became friends to go against Jesus. This is in Luke 23, verse 12. Now, what was the purpose in verse 1? What was the purpose of the Pharisees and Sadducees asking for a sign? Why did they, well, they're together now, they're trying to to go against Jesus. Why did they ask for a sign here?
It was a test.
It was a test. It was a test. And what were they trying to test Jesus? It was a test because they wanted to try to find some negative area that can prove that the miracles he had done was not from heaven. They were trying to trap him. They were trying to find out what he was doing. It's not the first time that this has occurred by the Pharisees and Sadducees. If you go back to Matthew 9, go back to Matthew 9:11. We talked about this ever so briefly last week, and I know Brandon went over it, but 9:11. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why do you eat with sinners?" In Matthew 12, go to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12, 1 and 2. It talks about the disciples on Sabbath. And at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And back last week in Matthew, go back to Matthew 15, the very first two verses, it talks about violating the tradition of the elders. They were trying to make something out of it. And now again here in the 16th chapter, starting with verse 1, they're trying to, again, claim something that is incorrect. Find something to charge him with or to disprove him and the miracles that he's been doing. So they're asking for a sign here. Now, verse 2 and verse 3. If someone would read 2 and 3, please.
He answered and said to them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and foul, and in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and gray. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah."
Okay.
And he left them and departed.
Thank you very much. So, they're able to predict the weather with natural things and occurrences, but they've missed the whole boat on more important spiritual matters that they need to be taken care of, like that pertain to the kingdom of heaven. Here it references the signs of the times. What does that mean?
They were seeing prophecy being fulfilled right before their eyes. And they were missing what they were watching. They'd been told about, but they missed it completely. What it meant.
Exactly right. Okay, so they had missed it entirely here in regard to that. Matthew chapter 3, go back to Matthew 3 and verse 17. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." Did I read that right? Yeah, 3:17. I did that. My fun. So, talked about the beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Christ himself had appeared upon the banks of Jordan and had been identified by John the Baptist as the Lamb of God. The Pharisees, as Ken said, the Pharisees had missed many signs of the times. They had neglected to see the truth in it, and so they had failed in this particular area here. Verse 4, as we've already read it, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Evil here is they're trying to destroy Jesus. And so they have gone back, adulterous in that they have left Jehovah and his prophets and have gone back to the traditions of men here. Someone read, if you would, verses 5 through 12, please. Chapter 16, 5 through 12.
Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said to them, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "Is it because we have taken no bread?" But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000, and how many baskets you took up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many large baskets you took up? How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees?" Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Okay. So Jesus is relocating. He's traveled to the other side of the sea or the lake, you might say, and they were short on physical bread. The disciples hadn't brought any, and they were misunderstanding exactly what was being said here by Jesus. In verse 6, it says, "And Jesus said to them, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." They were concerned about the physical bread, that they didn't bring any, and they didn't do their part in regard to that. But of course, leaven here references not that of like leaven in bread. Leaven here in verse 6 is referenced as what? What is it referencing here as leaven here? Teaching the Pharisees, which was, what would be one word you can say leaven is here? Influence, evil influence. Exactly, evil influence and teachings of the Pharisees. Even evil. It was not correct. The Pharisees were hypocrites. They were strict observers of the law of Moses. They acted one way and taught another way. Sadducees were materialistic. They denied any spiritual life, the possibility of resurrection, and the existence of angels. Look over that. Let's read that verse. Matthew 22, verse 30. Matthew 22, verse 30. "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God of heaven here." Now, the teachings of the Pharisees, we've already said, was corrupt. It was puffing up the hearts of individuals in the wrong way. It was like leaven with bread. It causes it to puff up. The evil, the leaven here that we're talking about is the false teachings and the influence that they have in misleading individuals in the wrong way. They had already had miracles, and now they wanted a sign from heaven, and they didn't need to have that at all. Now, Jesus is still warning his disciples to beware of the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, are there modern day Pharisees and Sadducees? Are there doctrines that permeate and spread through the Lord's church like leaven? Of course, okay. Any examples? Any examples? Yes, John?
Instrumental music's fine.
Okay, say instrumental music is fine. There's one example, exactly right. Most error that works its way in the church is usually because of two categories, according to some of the commentaries. One, it follows the thought of the Pharisees, traditions of men proclaimed as doctrine, or doctrines of the Bible are rejected as impossible to fulfill, like the Sadducees did. So Jesus was warning them then, and also warns us now that we need to be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, because it's still prevalent and can still happen for us today, just as it did back then. This concludes our class. We'll probably have a couple of minutes left. Thank you for your attention, and Brandon will be back next week to continue the study. Thank you so much.